Hello, Jay Dalton. Thanks for connecting with us to answer some questions about Phobos and Deimos.
Glad to be here.
So, we've had a really wild summer with some unprecedented heat. It feels some days like we're never going to live in a post-COVID world. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how some of this stuff might feel a little too familiar in your dystopian science fiction work.
Yeah, I mean, I started writing Phobos and Deimos like over 8 years ago. So obviously a lot has happened in that time while I've been drawing it. And well, the core story hasn't changed very much since I finished writing the script. Like I have been making subtle edits to pages as I draw them. So I think the biggest example is like when I started writing Phobos and Deimos, I don't think anyone had yet heard of long-termism. If you don't know what long-termism is, it's this weird, I'm going to call it a philosophy that a whole bunch of uber millionaires have, that they can disregard the harm they do in the present because they're focused on the well-being of humanity a million years from now, which is garbage, obviously, because the people who write the history that people will read a million years from now are the people who are alive right now being harmed by millionaires. So anyways, like as this was coming out, this sort of new philosophy was becoming more known by the rest of us, immediately it felt familiar to some of the stuff or some of the themes in this story. So I wanted to like at least put a few nods to it in my story. Actually, the first volume of Phobos and Deimos ends with kind of a I just drop a few phrases in that are meant to be sort of signposts that anyone who has heard of long-termism will recognize. And if you haven't heard of it, then you're never going to notice. But basically, I want there to be some subtext where that idea of I'm rich, I'm smart, I'm a tech guy, I can predict the future, the distant future, is garbage, and you should not trust anyone who says something like that.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Well, connected to that, how do you feel about the direction that everything's kind of moving in? Are you feeling like we might be able to avoid moving in the same direction, or are you thinking we might end up in a similar type world?
Are we not in a dystopia right now? Actually, I said somewhere else that I don't, even though whenever I talk about Phobos and Deimos, I talk about it as being a dystopia. I didn't actually write it as a dystopia. I wanted to do something that would be a harmful society, but not like an immediately dangerous one, because that feels much more relevant to the world we live in, where it's not 1984. It's not V for Vendetta. Like people could actually live here and live their lives and say this is fine, because the fire that's in the room isn't actually reaching them. And so that's kind of what I set out to write here is a world like that. That said, the problems they have in Phobos and Deimos are different problems from what we have now. It would be incredibly depressing to say the exact same problems we have in 2023 will not yet still be solved 500 years in the future. So there's a scene in the story where they sort of talk about, and this scene is meant to be like propaganda from the state about how important it is that the world is set up the way it is. But the idea is that, but of course, like any good propaganda, it's based on some core of truth that every generation causes problems, climate change, for example, and then the next generation has to fix those problems, but then ends up causing its own problems in return. So like the late 1800s, early 1900s, when whaling was at its height. Whales were very quickly going extinct. They were being hunted for their oil, and pretty soon there weren't going to be any whales left. And so someone invented this brand new, brilliant invention. What if we have petroleum? What if we just dig it out of the ground? We don't have to kill any whales, and we can build you a machine that is much better for both the whales being killed at sea and the horses dying in the street when they break their legs because they have a life expectancy. And so that's great. We've got petroleum now, but then petroleum causes its own disasters. And now we have climate change. Now we got to fix that.
Right.
And so we're going to replace it with electric cars and like use lithium that we dig out of mines in Bolivia and cause political problems everywhere that happens.
Yeah, I often think about the impending lithium crisis that's after we resolve the climate crisis.
It's just one thing after another. We never seem to get to the end of it.
Well, possibly on a slightly sunnier note, Phobos and Deimos does have a lot of really amazing technological advancements. I know I really like the idea of a little personal assistant. I'd love to have a tiny shark. But I wondered if there's any particular advancements that you wish we actually did have in our current world.
I mean, I would like to have that shark too. I think the shark is a lot of fun. It's basically like Siri if Siri was a hologram, but I feel like the main sort of, and this part is maybe not very realistic, but the main difference with the holographic assistants in this story is that they're not run by a giant company. Like the Papadum, the shark assistant, is basically self-contained. It's not subject to updates from like a global algorithm. And so you can tell it things in confidence and it will actually keep those in confidence rather than selling all your secrets to advertisers. So that's, if we could get a personal assistant that is like actually a personal assistant and not an employee of Amazon, that'd be great. I want that.
Right. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's a profit model in that.
No, there's not. They would make money at that. People would pay good money for that, I think, but it's not profitable enough.
It would only pay for it one time, though.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anyways, I will actually mention, if anyone wants their own Papadum, we have an enamel pin version. It won't organize your life, but
it also won't sell your secrets to Amazon. So there you go.
There you go. You can kind of have it. So switching gears here. Phobos and Deimos stars a young Black Muslim woman, and that's not who you are. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about writing for a character that is from a very different background than yourself. What steps did you take to really make sure Maida came across authentically, considering she's living a different lived experience than yourself?
Yeah. So like the inspiration for her character, a lot of it came from the students I was teaching when I lived in London. So I wanted to have a character, like a main character, who was from that world, who was basically an East Londoner, but in the future. And so because I'm not who she is, I didn't want to make those sort of identity issues the theme of the story. So it's not about being Muslim. It's not about being Black. It's not about being a woman. It's not, well, it is about being a refugee. That part's true. But so those things are sort of present in her character, but they're not what the story is about, because I don't feel like I'm the person to tell that story. And I feel like it's different to have a character in a story who is from a specific context without needing to make it about that context. And then what I did when I had my script finished for the story is I hired some editors to go through to read the script and give me feedback. And I did end up making some changes to characters or to things that happened to them based on that feedback. So I had one editor who was an author from North Africa, who's Muslim or from a Muslim background, and an editor who is from Swahili culture in East Africa. And he gave me some pointers on the culture and things that Maida was doing that he felt didn't represent the culture very well, so I changed them.
Oh, wow. Would you want to give an example of one of the changes you made?
Sure. I mean, for the Swahili culture, one thing that he said is that the way I had the script written was Maida was not nice enough to her aunt. And I feel like, oh, this is just my sort of blind spot being from a North American culture where like you can be a little more disrespectful to your parents, to your elders in white Canadian culture than you can in East African culture. So I changed some of her interactions with her aunt and with her mom to sort of reflect that better, I think.
Okay, right on. Now, I know that you did draw on personal experience for this work because you've often mentioned that your time working in East London in the mid-2000s was a big inspiration. Mm-hmm. So how did you get from being a teacher in East London in the mid-2000s to revolutionaries into the not so distant future of Earth?
Well, it started, I mean, a big part of it is the idea of like moving from one country to another and trying to make a life for yourself there. So I've done that a couple of times. I did that in London. I did that in Taiwan. I lived in Ohio for a couple of years when I was a kid, which American culture and Canadian culture are not that different, but it's still, when you're a middle school kid, those small differences feel bigger than they are. So it was that, and also, and like knowing that I had so many students who had been through experiences like that, but on a much grander scale because they're moving from farther. And then also when I was working in British schools, I came away with some very strong opinions about the British school system that I wanted to write about. But I didn't want to write about them from the point of view of a teacher because who wants to read that? That's not interesting. So I had to come up with a way to write that from the point of view of a student, which is a little tricky. But I hope people will get that some of the things that happen in the English school system are less than ideal.
Right on. Well, I think that when I was an instructor, I had some sense of what it was like to be a student. And then when I was a student again, I found that I guess a lot of my assumptions were proven correct. So yeah, as a teacher, you do get a sense of student life.
Sure.
So in your work, you do have a very different world from the one that we're living in. And I'm sure a certain amount of explanation is sometimes required. How do you strike a balance with kind of introducing your readers to this world without overloading them with too many concepts at once? And also in terms of just science fiction writing, are there any points of inspiration that sort of led you to some of the concepts that you introduced in this work?
Yeah. So I think it's really hard not to info dump. I think there were a couple of times in the story where I think that's what it ended up being, is just me explaining the world to you. I tried to do that as little as possible, of course, because that's not like the people are reading for the characters primarily. It helps that it's a story about someone who, like, kind of a fish out of water. Maida isn't from this world, and so it doesn't make sense to her either. And so as the explanations come, they're coming to her at the same time as they're coming to the reader. And also, I feel like being thrown into an unfamiliar setting is like, that's what it's like in real life. Like, you just show up and you figure stuff out as you go, and things become relevant as they become relevant to the plot. In terms of other science fiction stories, there are quite a few science fiction books that I've sort of like taken inspiration from. At one point I mentioned Ansibles. An Ansible is an instantaneous communication device. That's from Ursula K. Le Guin, came up with that word. Someone has tried to invent that thing in real life, and I don't think it succeeded. But the people who were trying to make it in real life were also calling it an Ansible, so I think that's just what it is now.
Oh,
and like the idea of being able to predict the future, that's I hope it's pretty clear that that's from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, because there is a lot of sort of, in a way, this book is kind of my response to those books. Like I love those books, they're great, but like, do we really want to live in a world where Harry Seldon is real? I don't know.
now you're making me want to watch the Foundation TV series, but
I haven't seen it. I don't know if it's any good or not.
all right, keeping on topic here. So this is maybe a fun one. I wanted to specifically talk about one of the scenes from the comic. I know this is something that was discussed at one of the Cloudscape meetings. Tamaseb and Maida go to see a classic film in the theater, and there's a bit of a kind of a mashup of the future culture and the past culture, and then even within that, it sort of feels like they're watching Titanic, but the response to it is a lot more like watching The Room. And I'm just curious, and we can kind of get into spoilers on this one.
Yeah, it's not a major plot point, so
Yeah,
that's fair.
But yeah, if you wanted to talk a little bit about that scene and maybe what inspired it, and maybe how it connects to some of the broader themes of the work of Phobos and Deimos.
Yeah. So a lot of science fiction stories will do the thing where it's the future and the characters are very reverential of present day culture. Like on Star Trek, they'll like watch a movie on the Enterprise and it's like a movie from the 1920s, and everyone is, oh, this is so great, we're watching a movie, this is a classic. And they never seem to have their own culture from their present. It's all stuff from the 20th century. And like, that's weird. Like, I'm a fan of history, and I'm not super reverential of just the works of the 1700s and nothing since then. And I'm going to have my own ideas about anything written at that time period.
We could do a separate podcast about how Star Trek is very specifically, every character is specifically focused on Europe or American-made art from a very thin sliver of 20th century history.
Yeah, I've got a lot of opinions on that.
If they watched a movie, I would be surprised. I think the normal MO is just we're listening to classical music and we're watching a Shakespeare performance.
I think it was Enterprise where they had like an official movie night on the ship. Which is okay. Okay, right. So yeah, so like basically this scene in Phobos and Deimos, two main characters, they go to a movie and they see Titanic. And I was trying to think, okay, so what movies might actually still be around in 500 years? Because in order for a piece of art to still be around after that much time, it has to have felt relevant to people basically the whole way through. Like there can't be a point where people are just like, I don't care about that, and then it'll just be forgotten about. Like no one remembers any of Shakespeare's contemporaries. They've all been like, unless you're like a Shakespeare scholar, like no one remembers those. It's just the small set of plays written by this one guy. So I came up with a list of like, all right, what are and it's pure speculation, of course, like what movies do I think might last this long? I settled on Titanic as the one that we would see on camera because it has some thematic reference, like connections to the story. It's about class. It's about like star-crossed lovers kind of a thing. There's disaster. So it feels like this would be a movie that people in this world might actually still care about. It's also a movie that it doesn't rely on a lot of other information. Like you should probably know going in that there was this ship called the Titanic. But even if you don't, like the movie tells you that. You don't have to have seen a bunch of other movies. You don't have to have a lot of cultural context or anything like that. Everything is just kind of given to you right on the camera, like on camera. And it feels like it would be a movie that translates well across a language barrier of 500 years. It's not like full of pop culture references or whatever. It's a really simple story, but I think a simple story is more likely to survive.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Well, I'm excited to finish reading volume 1 and see how it all connects. Maybe talking more about sort of the direction of the story. I know for a lot of authors, as they write, and I mean, I've had this experience myself, you start writing a character or a scene or a story beat, and something unexpected kind of grabs you. Maybe a character that was supposed to just sit in the background starts to take more prominence. Were there any sort of surprising changes that happened as you were writing page by page? Were there characters or situations that took a lot more prominence than you originally had intended?
I mean, that certainly happens with characters. Like when you start a story, you don't necessarily know everything about every character. And then at a certain point, once you know like who they are, like some decisions make sense and other decisions don't make sense. Like, you have to sort of make it make sense for the reader. So there were times where I had in my head like, oh, this character is going to do this, but then I had to justify like why. Like based on what we know of the character so far, why is this character going to make the choice that I want them to for plot reasons? They can't do that unless it makes sense for character reasons.
Okay. Interesting. Switching gears again, kind of going back to the beginning, your book has AI technology, and we've seen AI become a huge topic in in our contemporary times. There's been lots of discussion about positives and negatives and capabilities of AI. As this AI, I'm going to say AI hype was sort of taking off, did you go back and make changes or revisions to your script for that reason? So maybe not necessarily for any plot reason, but just so that you could make the AI technology in your work feel like it is maybe connected to sort of what's happening today. Like, for example, you had a recent scene with Maida switching out the coolant for a CPU. Feels like it's very connected with like quantum computing, which is also going to need like these cooling canisters. Like, was that a specific change that you made? So
the quantum computing thing, that was in the original script. Like I had heard of quantum computers already. The idea has been around for a while. Like if you Google pictures of quantum computers, they look awesome. They're very science fiction. And so, I mean, that was basically straight out of like what's happening in science. The sort of the AI hype stuff, had like the AIs that are in my story are more about, they're more in line with the idea people had about AI before the hype, like before we had like chatbots and stuff. And that hype is like, and that sort of that concept of AI, like a computer that can think, that has that's definitely been feeding into the current hype. But the things that people are calling AI are not that. They're like large language learning models, I think the term.
Right.
So there isn't anything like that in this story. Not just because we didn't know those existed 8 years ago, or that they would exist, but also I think it's mostly just hype. I think that stuff's going to go away pretty quickly.
Right. I mean, I've heard.
I don't think we're going to have Chat GPT 500 years from now. It's not going to
Right.
last.
I've heard that discussion that, Chat GPT is just predictive text,
Yeah.
ultimately. Really fancy predictive text. But that hype machine is making people think that like we're 100 years away from commander data or something. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
not
that hype, like the we're going to build Commander Data hype, that's been around a long time. So Chat GPT just latched onto that. It didn't create that.
Meanwhile, yeah, we still haven't figured out self-driving cars, which keep getting promised to happen next year or something.
Every year, it's next year.
Yeah. Anyways, so maybe, yeah, shifting away from the technological to the like social and political. Again, in our kind of contemporary time, we've seen the rights of women with the like Roe versus Wade decision in the United States. A lot of this, I'm going to say, moral panic involving trans people and rollbacks on LGBTQ plus peoples happening all around the world right now, often being used as kind of a political football. Have any of those current events influenced how you've approached Phobos and Deimos? And maybe did they even cause you to reconsider sort of how you had originally envisioned things, or the solutions or the problems you envisioned?
So I mean, when I started writing this book before Trump was elected, and then when he was elected, that did set me back quite a bit in terms of the writing, because that was not a future outcome I thought was going to happen. Like all of these, the current moral panics that are happening, all of that's super depressing, and I don't want that to still exist in 500 years. So no, the sort of the current the sort of the current fascism that we're seeing is not something that's sort of factored into the writing of the story. But one thing that did factor into the story that is kind of connected to that is, and this ties into stuff that we don't see yet because it happens in volume 2, but the idea of having scapegoats is definitely something I was thinking a lot about when I was writing this. And the scapegoat of choice seems to change over time. So what I was thinking about when I was writing this is sort of the war on terror, and how Muslims were kind of the scapegoats of Western countries, where we were supposed to be scared of anyone who looked like they might be from the Middle East. And that was clearly garbage, because like I'm teaching tiny children who are Muslim, and they're not dangerous, they're just kids. And yet at the same time, British newspapers are spreading fear about these kids that I'm teaching, and that's not okay. So the scapegoats of choice have changed. Like, it's 20 years after I lived in Britain, and now we're supposed to be scared of trans kids. And like, okay, how does that make sense? Like, it's the exact same thing. They've just changed out the names. It's like the world's worst Mad Lib.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about that Mad Lib, of the idea of like, society has decided that the way to hold itself together in a certain shape is to pick one group and say it's them, it's all their fault. So that is definitely part of the story. Specifically, it being like women's rights and LGBTQ rights. Those weren't the things I was thinking of, but it fits because it's the same thing we've had forever.
Right. Yes. Sadly, the world's oldest Mad Lib, I think.
Yeah.
But I do remember after the Trump election seeing some of your Twitter posts and your discouragement. So I am happy that you found a way to make it work.
Yeah, no, I mean, basically what happened was I realized that because I said Phobos and Deimos is not supposed to be a dystopia. It's like somewhere in between a dystopia and a utopia, where it's got some good things and some bad things, and the story is about the bad things. So I realized that, the types of people I had been writing about, the sort of the world leaders who are okay with there being scapegoats, but are not okay with there being like insurrections. Like, those people still exist. Like, they're still with us. They're not Trump. He's the one in charge, like he's the one in favor of having like straight up fascist insurrections. But the other type of leader, they're still here too. I can still write about them.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No shortage of ineffective politicians. But all right. All right. So maybe lightening things up again. Is there anything in Phobos and Deimos that feels self-indulgent, like any characters or other elements that maybe you included just sort of, I don't know, for selfish reasons outside of the main plot?
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, the whole scene with the movie where they watch a movie, that felt pretty self-indulgent. That doesn't move the plot along very much. It was basically just me having fun. And there's little things like that. I put my cat in the comic just because I have drawn a couple of friends into the comic, so no one else is going to notice, but they'll notice.
Okay. Well, now I have to go through all the backgrounds with a magnifying glass.
You got to finish reading the story to find the page you're on.
All right. The plot thickens. I'm looking forward to it. Well, yeah, then maybe in terms of your creative process, I know you mostly work traditionally. There are, I think, some digital aspects to your process, but for the most part, I mean, you're hand coloring with a marker, right?
Yeah.
So, what are some of your preferred tools? If you could speak a little bit about your process.
Sure. I mean, the pencil is pencil on Bristol. The inks are it's India ink, either with a pen or with a brush. The color is Copic markers and other similar type markers. And I don't know, I find coloring digitally or coloring with markers to be faster than digital, at least for me, and more fun. I don't like looking at a screen for too long. And obviously I need Photoshop because I need to like scan these in and do the lettering because I don't want a hand letter. That's crazy. And clean everything up. You can edit a lot easier in Photoshop than you can on paper. But I like to do as much on paper as possible. Just not just because I enjoy the process more, but also I don't think it's slower.
Okay, interesting. I mean, I could see that to a certain extent. I feel like I wasn't coloring until I could color on an iPad. And then to me, it's a lot like using a marker, but
you know, you don't have to do with markers, you don't have to flat.
Right. That
I hate flatting.
That is, well, maybe that'll be the one benefit AI can give us in the future. We'll see. Now, kind of continuing with color here. I know you work with a limited color palette. I think in all your work, really. Like, is there a certain key number, or is there, like, what's your sort of thought process when you're developing your palettes? And are the palettes like per work, per scene? You know, if you could speak a little more about selecting color.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess this is on video. I can show you stuff here. So this is all my markers. That's a lot of markers. This is the small subset that I use for Phobos and Deimos. So it's still a lot of markers. It's not all the ones I have. And it's a limited palette, but yeah, I mean, it's not only 3 or 4 markers, because the problem with markers is you only have the one color. So if you want to have like a lighter version of that color or a darker version of that color, it's another marker. So I have like a range of blues, a range of magentas, a range of greens, but then I don't have any orange or red or yellow. So I find like when I'm creating a palette for something, it's usually a matter of like first taking out some colors. Like I'm not going to have these colors at all, and then adding in markers to fill the colors that I do want to have, and making sure I have enough of a range that I've got like 5 different blues from like lightest to darkest. And what I've been doing for Phobos and Deimos is I have a different palette for every planet, essentially. So most of the story takes place on Earth. So the main palette is for the whole bulk of the story. And then I have a different palette for Mars and a different palette for the moon.
Oh, okay. Sort of to give a sense of difference of place.
Yeah. Yeah. Like as soon as you're on Mars, you're going to recognize something's different.
Right. Okay. Last color question. I know that you are very outspoken in your dislike of the color green. And I guess I'm curious if in the process of doing this book and working with color, as you've progressed, do you find that there are certain greens that you're a little more forgiving of than others? Are there certain hues or shades that are less awful to you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the less green it is, the better. There is actually a lot of green in this story, but what I've done is I've channeled my distaste into theme, where any scene or setting that I want to, like, I want the reader to feel unsettled, I'll just throw a bunch of green in there. And like colors are highly subjective. Nobody else feels this way about green. This is just a me thing. But I'm trying to sort of transmit my distaste for green to the reader by putting it in settings that you're not meant to feel comfortable.
Right. I mean, I think with stuff like that, if it's a conscious choice, whether the reader feels the same way about green or not, I think the effect is still the same, because it becomes a signal to the reader that, like, on a subconscious,
this is that type of scene. Yeah. It's if it works at all, it's subconscious. Yeah. But yeah, I'm creating a color language.
Right. Yeah, which is great.
Like green means this, purple means this, blue means this.
Yeah. Okay. So in a recent post on I'm just gonna say Twitter.
It's Twitter still. That's all it is.
You incorporated your cat into a scene. Are there any other fun personal things that are either hidden in this work or maybe hidden in other works? And you already mentioned friends and family, but or there
Yeah.
may be other things, other pets or other objects that maybe are to be found.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, I don't even know if I remember everything I've done like that. I do often name my characters after students I've taught. Um, I never like do a one-to-one where this kid is now a character in the story because that doesn't seem okay.
Right.
But like Koya, for example, is one of my favorite characters, and she's named after a specific kid. That specific kid is not anything like the Toya in my story. They have very different personalities. But I don't know. It seemed like this is the perfect name for this made up character.
Okay. That's
And
interesting.
I do that a lot. Like a lot of these names are from people, from real people.
Hmm. That's interesting. I'm always hesitant to use names that are friends' names. I don't know.
But I think it's
I
if
overthink
it's a
it.
character you're not supposed to like, that feels like that would be a problem. Like Nat Fisher is not named after anyone specific.
Oh, all right, fair enough. You mentioned already that you don't like flatting. Um, in terms of other aspects of the creative process, are there other things like flatting that feel like a chore, or is it exclusively flatting?
Well, coloring is my favorite part. Inking, I'm not a huge fan of inking because it's just like tracing over something I've already done. It doesn't feel terribly creative. I've thought about skipping inking altogether and just scanning my pencils, but I'm never happy with my pencils. They always need a second draft. So it's a necessary function, I guess. The most difficult part is the writing. Like once I've got a script, then I can just sit down and I know exactly what I'm doing or near enough. I'm just like drawing the things that I wrote. But writing is very hard to predict exactly how long it's going to take. It's hard to judge whether it's successful or not. And it's not the fun part. Like I really enjoy having written stories and drawing the stories that I've written, but the actual writing process is something I don't look forward to.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if I would say I don't like the writing process, but I definitely find you need to be in a very specific headspace. And so I find that's the process that's the hardest to initiate because, inking, you can force yourself to pick up a penciled page and just start putting ink on it, whether you feel like it or not, and it'll be okay. But writing, you really have to put yourself in the zone, is sort of what I find.
Yeah, you can't necessarily speed it up. Like if you give yourself like enough hours out of a day and say this block of time is for penciling, and you can spend all that time penciling. Whereas writing, sometimes you need breaks. Sometimes you're stuck and you just need to give it time. And like sitting and staring at a monitor isn't going to make it happen any faster.
Right. And then for coloring, do you find that you need to get into any kind of a zone or a headspace for that, or is that something you can always just dive into?
Anywhere, anytime.
Nice.
Marker.
All right. I think this will be our last question here. So for people that have some experience reading long form web comics, a lot of times they'll have the experience of getting into a story and the story being incomplete. I know people reading Teaching This in Japan will definitely relate to starting a series and it not having an ending. But in terms of Phobos and Deimos, we're crowdfunding for printing volume 1. But there is a volume 2 planned. Maybe for like any people sitting on the fence, a little unsure if they want to back this project if it doesn't end up having a volume 2. What would you say to those people? Do you have any reassurances or or tips or like comments to tell people if they're worried about not getting to the end of the story?
I mean, who knows what's going to happen, right? Like, as a science fiction author, I can tell you no science fiction author can actually predict the future. But I have written the entire script. Like, I've written all the way to the end of volume 2. I know everything that's going to happen. I have it all thumbnailed. I just have to draw all those pages. So there's no uncertainty in terms of what the ending will look like. And I won't have the problem that I sometimes have with writing where I don't know what happens next. I get stuck. A fascist ends up in the White House, and then I don't feel like I can write anything about the future. Like, those are not concerns for the rest of Phobos and Deimos. I just have to draw another 300 pages. So yeah, that's where it's just a matter of having the time to do it.
There you go.
And
So
I'll also say that like, things ramp up in volume 2. Like, I've spent all of volume 1 setting up things that I want to pay off in volume 2. So there's a lot of stuff I'm really looking forward to drawing. Scenes, like specific scenes that I've had in mind since the very beginning, things that I've kind of left as mysteries in volume 1, that all those things need to get sorted out in volume 2.
ooh, well, that's a good teaser for volume 2.
I've pitched this as a story about a revolution. You haven't seen the revolution yet.
That's a good point. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure. Before we part ways, is there anything you wanted to add? Anything you want to plug, or I don't know, any recent works you want to shout out?
The Kickstarter. Go to the Kickstarter. It's got a week left. We are 62% of the way till the end. I think this is going to be a really nice book. I like the cover is going to be really nice. It's going to be like a hefty tome. It's worth your time. It's worth the space it'll take up on your bookshelf. Get it, but get it this week, because if we don't get enough backers, I don't know what we're going to do.
All right. Well, I'm sure people are going to back this project. Thanks again, and good luck with reaching your goal.
Thank you.